Death on the Danube, Chapter 1, The Maiden Voyage. Welcome to Stories Cafe. I'm your host for today's mystery, and we're joining Hercule Poirot aboard the luxurious river steamer Kaiserin Elizabeth as it glides along the majestic Danube in 1930s Europe. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in from today. Drop it in the comments. So grab a warm cup of Viennese coffee, perhaps with a few Austrian pastries, and let's unravel this tale of long-awaited revenge together. The morning mist draped the Danube like a delicate veil as I stood on the deck of the Kaiserin Elizabeth, savoring the crisp October air. My friend Hercule Poirot had described this journey as a restorative escape, a serene cruise through Europe's heart, far from the criminal intrigues that seemed to trail us in London. The opportunity had arisen unexpectedly. Poirot had resolved a case for a wealthy Austrian widow involving misplaced jewelry, a simple matter of a forgetful lady in a lost jewel box. In gratitude, she insisted on gifting us 2 first-class tickets for the maiden voyage of the Kaiserin Elizabeth, declaring that a detective of Poirot's caliber deserved nothing less than the finest. Mon ami, Poirot had said, his eyes gleaming. We must accept this generous offer. The little gray cells, they need a respite. What better than the tranquil waters of the Danube in the refined company of fellow travelers? With a playful twinkle, he added, it would be most impolite to refuse such kindness. How mistaken he would prove to be. The Kaiserin Elizabeth was a magnificent vessel, her brass fittings gleaming in the pale sunlight, her mahogany-paneled corridors exuding old-world elegance. She carried some 30 passengers, a select group who could afford such opulent accommodations. As we settled into our adjoining cabins, I dared to hope this might indeed be the peaceful holiday Poirot had envisioned. That hope began to waver at dinner on the first evening. Undercurrents of tension rippled through the dining salon. We were seated at the captain's table, a privilege secured by Poirot's reputation. The captain, a jovial Austrian named Herr Linderman, was regaling us with tales of the river's history when a man of about 60 entered. Tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and a commanding presence honed by years of authority. His expensive evening attire couldn't mask a certain coarseness in his manner. "Ah," the captain murmured, "Herr Heinrich Müller, one of Germany's most successful industrialists. Made his fortune during the war, they say." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest, though he remained silent. Müller's arrival seemed to cast a shadow over the room. At a nearby table, a young woman with short blonde hair and anxious eyes glanced up from her untouched soup. She bore a striking resemblance to Müller. Same strong jawline, same piercing blue eyes, but lacked his confidence. His niece, Fräulein Greta Hoffmann, the captain whispered. Charming girl, but she seems troubled by something. Even more striking was the reaction of a distinguished gentleman across the salon, about 50, with the bearing of a military man. His fork clattered against his plate when he saw Müller. His face flushed crimson, and his hands clenched into fists on the white tablecloth. Herr Otto Brenner, captain continued, also in business, I believe, though not quite as successful as Herr Müller. The most intriguing reaction, however, came from a woman seated alone at a corner table. She was perhaps 40, with refined elegance that spoke of true aristocracy. Her dark hair was arranged in a sophisticated shiner, and her black evening dress was cut in the latest Paris fashion. When Müller appeared, she had been delicately sipping her wine, but her hand froze halfway to her lips. I watched, fascinated, as she set down her glass with exaggerated care. The Countess Marovich whispered to the captain, "Serbian nobility, you know, lost everything during the war. Poor woman, but maintained such dignity." It was then that Miller himself approached our table. His manner was affable enough, though there was something in his eyes that reminded me of a man constantly looking over his shoulder. "Captain Linderman," he said, his English evilly accented but precise. "I trust you will ensure we have a smooth journey. Have a particular need for rest and quiet, of course, Herr Miller. May ye prison Monsieur Hercule Poirot, the famous detective, and his friend, Captain Hastings." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly at the word detective, but he extended his hand cordially enough. "Indeed, how fascinating. I hope, Miss Poirot, that your presence aboard our little ship does not preage any unpleasantness." P's reply was smooth as silk. "But naturally, Herr Mahler, I am here purely for the pleasure of the voyage. Though I confess, I find myself already intrigued by the, how shall I put it, the psychological atmosphere of our fellow passengers." Psychological atmosphere. Miller's laugh was not entirely convincing. "Surely you read too much into things, monsieur. We are resumed travelers seeking relaxation," Demopua agreed. "Yet observe, if ya will, how the very mention of your name seems to affect the tranquility of the dining salon." I followed Poirot's discreet glance and saw that he was right. The young woman, Greta, was now staring at her uncle with an expression of poorly concealed desperation. Her Briner had risen from his table and was making his way toward the salon doors, but not before casting a look of such hatred at Mueller that it made me thoroughly uncomfortable. Most curious of all was the Countess. As Muller spoke, she had been removing her evening gloves, but when his voice carried across the salon an particularly loud burst of German, she fumbled with them badly. The delicate text gloves fell to the floor, and I observed that her hands were trembling slightly as she bent to retrieve them. Herr Mueller caught a voice from across the room. A thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles approached our table. "I do hope you are feeling well this evening. The excitement of travel can be quite taxing for someone of your delicate constitution." Miller's face darkened. "Dr. Richter, I have told you before that I do not require your constant solicitude. I am perfectly well." Of course, the doctor replied soothingly. "You must remember what we discussed about your nerves, the importance of avoiding any unnecessary stress." After the doctor had withdrawn, Muller excused himself rather abruptly, muttering something about needing to check the security of his cabin door. I watched him go, noting how his eyes swept the salon as if cataloging potential threats. "Trying," murmured Pooh, as we were left alone with the captain. "Tell me, Captain Lindeman, have you observed anything unusual about the relationships among your passengers?" The captain shifted uncomfortably. "Well, MC Poirot, I do not like to gossip, but there does seem to be some tension. Herr Briner specificalacused at his cabin be as far as possible from Herr Mueller's. And the Countess asked several questions about the ship's passenger manifest, most unusual for a lady of her breeding. Us retired to our cabins that evening. I found myself oddly unsettled. The ship's gentle rocking and the soft sound of water against the hull should have been soothing, but instead I felt as though were floating through a powder keg. The undercurrents of hostility among the passengers were palpable, and at the center of it all was Heinrich Muller, a man who seemed to inspire hatred wherever he went. I shared these observations with Poirot as we stood on the deck watching the lights of a small village slip past in the darkness. "You are most perceptive, Hastings," Hess said thoughtfully. "Indeed, I sense that we are surrounded by people carrying heavy burdens of the past, the psychology of hatred. It is a most fascinating study, and when Suke emotions are confined within the limits of a ship," he left the sentence hanging ominously. I pulled my coat closer against the night chill, suddenly eager for the warmth and safety of my cabin. Something in Poirot's tone suggested that our peaceful cruise might prove to be anything but restful. Chapter 2. Death. In the morning, I was awakened from a peaceful sleep by the sound of urgent voices in the corridor outside my cabin. The morning light filtered weakly through the porthole, suggesting it was still quite early, perhaps 7 o'clock. For a moment, I lay still, hoping that whatever disturbance had arisen would resolve itself without requiring my attention. However, the voices grew more agitated, and I heard the unmistakable scent of the captain's heavy footsteps hurrying past my door. Reluctantly, I rose and dressed quickly, then stepped into the corridor to investigate. The scene that greeted me was one of considerable alarm. Several passengers had emerged from their cabins in various states of undress, their faces bearing expressions of curiosity and concern. At the far end of the corridor, near Henry Miller's cabin, I could see Captain Lindemann speaking in urgent hushed tones with France, the elderly steward who attended to our section of the ship. Hastings, came Poirot's voice from behind me. I turned to find my friend already impeccably dressed, his mustaches waxed to perfection despite the early hour. What is this commotion that disturbs the morning tranquility? I'm not certain, I replied, but it seems to center around Herr Muller's cabin. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. Indeed. Then, perhaps, we should offer our assistance to the good Captain Lindemann. We made our way through the small crowd of passengers toward the captain, who looked up at our approach with obvious relief. "Poole," he said, his usual joviality replaced by grave concern. "I fear we have a most serious situation, Hermela. He appears to be dead." "Dead?" I exclaimed. "What? How? What happened?" The captain wrung his hands. "France here discovered him when he brought the morning coffee. The door was locked from the inside, and when there was no response to his knocking, he used his master key. Miller was found slumped over his writing desk. It appears," he lowered his voice further, "it appears he may have taken his own life." Pugh's eyes sharpened with professional interest, and the cabin remains undisturbed. "Precisely as France found it," the captain confirmed. "I have allowed no one to enter except myself for the briefest inspection. I thought, perhaps, given your expertise," Natural Maltro replied. "With your permission, Captain, I should like to examine the scene. Hastings, you will assist me." The captain nodded gratefully and produced a key. "Please, Poirot, any assistance you can provide would be most welcome." As we approached Miller's cabin door, I noticed that the other passengers had begun to disperse, though not without considerable whispering. I caught sight of Greta, Alphen's pale face, as she retreated to her cabin and observed Dr. Richter adjusting his spectacles nervously as he spoke to Otto Briner in low tones. The cabin door opened to reveal a scene of apparent tragic finality. Henrik Mueller sat slumped forward over the small writing desk, his head resting in his crossed arms. An empty brandy glass sat beside his right hand. An ash sheet of paper lay beneath his elbow. The cabin itself was surprisingly neat, far more orderly than I would have expected from my brief observation of Miller's generally disheveled appearance at dinner. "Voila," murmured Poirot, stepping carefully into the cabin. "The apparent suicide of Henrik Miller. But observe, mon ami, observe everything, and tell me what you see." I followed his gaze around the small but luxurious cabin. The bed was made with military precision, every item off clothing, hung or folded with meticulous care. The writing desk held only these essential items: the brandy glass, the paper, a fountain pen, and a small leather portfolio. "It's remarkably tidy," I observed, almost too naturally so. "Crissimo," Poirot agreed. "And what else strikes you? A beauty unfortunate." Harry Miller. I studied the scene more carefully. Well, he's fully dressed, even to his shoes. Rather odd if he was planning total end his life in his own cabin. Trepia and the brandy glass leaned closer, being careful not to disturb anything. It's empty, naturally, but there's a peculiar sheen on the rim, almost as if I paused, uncertain. As if what? Hastings. As if there might be lipstick in it, I said, feeling rather foolish. But surely that's impossible. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Impossible or merely unexpected? Continue your observations. I turned my attention to the paper beneath Muller's elbow. In a shaky hand, someone had written, "I can no longer bear the weight of my past sins. The ghosts of the war will not let me rest. I choose to end my suffering. May God forgive me." Heinrich Müller, the suicide note, I said. Rather melodramatic, isn't it? Indeed, Poirot agreed. In the handwriting. What do you make of it? I studied the script carefully. It's definitely unsteady, which one might expect from a man in such distress. But there's something I can't quite put my finger on it. The formation of velators, perhaps the spacing. Before I could respond, Captain Linderman maneuvered in the doorway. "Sure, Poirot. I hate to disturb you, but Dr. Richter has arrived. Okay. He insists on examining the body." "Of course," Poirot replied. "But first, Captain, might I ask, was H. Muller in the habit of keeping his cabin in such perfect order?" The captain looked puzzled. "Perfect order? Actually, no. Franciathan complained about the state of his cabin. Hercule Muller was not a tidy man by nature." Interesso, Poirot murmured. "And the door was definitely locked from the inside?" "Absolutely. Franz had to use his master key to gain entry. Dr. Richter entered the cabin. To his face grave, he immediately went to examine Miller's body, checking for signs of life, though it was clearly too late for any such hope." "How long has he been dead?" I asked. "Several hours, I should estimate," Dr. Richter replied. "Perhaps since the early hours of the morning. The body is quite cold." As the doctor continued his examination, I noticed Poole methodically studying the contents of the writing desk. He paused over the leather portfolio and I saw him carefully extract several papers. "Business correspondence," he said quietly to me, including, most interestingly, a catalog from a medical supply company. Quite extensive pharmaceuticals, surgical instruments, various chemical compounds. "Is that significant?" I asked. "Perhaps, perhaps not. But it is curious that a man planning suicide should be conducting such business affairs." Dr. Richter completed his preliminary examination and stood up. "I can find no obvious signs of violence," he announced. "It appears consistent with what one might expect from an overdose of some sort combined with alcohol." "An overdose?" Captain Landerman asked. "The pupils are quite dilated," Dr. RTOR explained, "and there's a faint but distinctive odor. Some form of narcotic, I believe, though I would need to conduct proper tests to be certain." Poole had been listening intently to this exchange. "Dr. Richter," he said, "in your professional opinion, would such a method narcotics combined with alcohol be consistent with suicide?" "It is certainly possible, though I must say the combination suggests someone with considerable count of pharmaceuticals. The dosage would need to be quite precise." "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "Most educational." As we prepared to leave the cabin, Poirot paused at the threshold and turned back for one final look at the scene. His eyes swept over every detail with the methodical precision of a man recording a fidance for future consideration. "Mon ami," he said to me as we stepped into the corridor, "what we have witnessed is most certainly a death by suicide." He shook his head slowly. "I think not. No, Hastings, I believe we are dealing with something far more complex and far more sinister. The implications of his words sent a chill down my spine as we mowed our way back to our own cabins. The peaceful cruise now transformed into something altogether more ominous. Chapter 3. Secrets and Lies. By mid-morning, the Kaiserin Elizabeth had taken on the atmosphere of a floating morgue. The news of Heinrich Müller's death had spread among the passengers, and conversations were conducted in hushed tones throughout Theshup's public areas. Captain Linderman had wisely confined the investigation to a small conference room adjacent to his quarters, where Poirot could conduct his inquiries with proper privacy. Mime Poirot announced to the assembled suspects, his manner both courteous and authoritative. I regret that circumstances require us to discuss such unpleasant matters. However, the death of H.M. Müller presents certain irregularities that demand clarification. I observed the faces of our fellow passengers as Poirot spoke, its peculiar expression of someone trying to appear appropriately shocked while harboring private thoughts they preferred to keep hidden. Greta Hoffman sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Otto Briner maintained an almost military bearing, though I noticed a muscle twitching in his jaw. Dr. Richter cleaned his spectacles repeatedly, while the Countess Morovich maintained an air of aristocratic Paris that seemed somehow fragile. Now then, Poirot continued, let us begin with you, Feline Hoffman. You were, I understand, Herr Müller's niece. Grader's voice trembled slightly as she replied, yes, M.C. Poirot. My father was Henrik's younger brother. He died in the war. And Hendrik became my guardian. And your relationship with your uncle, it was harmonious. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Harmonious? Hardly. Heinrich was not a man given to sentiment or familial affection. He provided for my education, yes, but only because it reflected well upon his reputation to have a respectable niece. Yet you chose to accompany him on this cruise, Poirot observed gently. Greta's composure cracked. I had little choice saying the matter. My financial circumstances are desperate. I had Hapeto persuade Henrik to advance me my inheritance, or at least to provide me with a modest allowance. I am 28 years old. Misha, Poirot, and I have never been permitted to earn my own living. Henrik controlled every aspect of my life. And now, with his death, your situation changes. I suppose it does, she admitted. Reluctantly, Heinrich often spoke of his will, usually as a threat. He claimed to have left me everything, but warned that any defiance of his wishes would result in my disinheritance. I never knew whether to believe him or not. Kuhn nodded thoughtfully and turned his attention to Otto Briner. Herr Briner, you are also in business, I understand. Rena's military bearing became more pronounced. I was in business, Miss Poirot, until Heinrich Müller destroyed everything I had built. Indeed? Perhaps you would care to elaborate? The man's face darkened with remembered fury. My family owned a small pharmaceutical company in Munich. We manufactured medical supplies, bandages, antiseptics, pain medications, honest work, serving those who needed healing. During the war, we could barely keep up with demand. Soldiers were dying for want of proper medical care. A noble calling, Poirot observed. Noble? Yes, but not profitable enough for Heinrich Müller, Briner continued bitterly. He approached us in 1943, offering to buy our entire stock at prices that seemed generous. What I didn't realize was that he was simultaneously negotiating with, or competitors, driving up prices and creating artificial shortages. While German soldiers died from infected wounds, Müller was selling medical supplies to the highest bidder, often to his enemies. "This is a serious accusation," Poirot said. Quietly, "It is the truth," Brenner replied. "My younger brother was among those who died, not from enemy fire, but from gangrene that could have been prevented with proper medical supplies. Supplies that Miller had cornered and was selling for 10 times their value, and your business destroyed. When the war ended, investigations into war-to-Met perfidery began. Muller had been careful to implicate others while keeping his own hands clean. My family's company was accused of price manipulation. We lost everything: oratory, our reputation, our livelihood." I watched Brena's face as he spoke, seeing the pain and rage that had clearly festered for years. Here was a man with motive aplenty for murder. Poirot turned next to Dr. Richter. "Doctor, you mentioned yesterday that you had been treating Herr Mueller. Perhaps you could enlighten us about his condition." Dr. Richter shifted uncomfortably. "Patient confidentiality. You understand?" "I understand. That the patient is now deceased," Poirot replied firmly, "and the withholding information might impede the investigation into his death." The doctor sighed. "Very well." Heinrich had been suffering from severe depression and paranoid delusions. He was convinced that someone from his past was seeking revenge, spoke constantly of a ghost who haunted him, someone he believed had survived the war when everyone thought them dead. How long had he been experiencing these symptoms? For several months, the paranoia was becoming increasingly acute. He had begun checking his locks repeatedly, varying his routines, even testing his food for poison. I had prescribed sedatives, but Heinrich was reluctant to take them regularly. "And in your professional opinion, was Herm capable of suicide?" Dr. Richter hesitated. He had expressed pseudo-wild ideation. "Yes, but typically, such patients either act impulsively or plan meticulously. Heinrich's supposed suicide note seems inconsistent with the usual patterns of thought and expression." Finally, Poirot addressed the Countess. "Madame la Comtesse, you have been notably quiet during these proceedings." The Countess raised her chin with aristocratic dignity. "I fail to see how the sordid business affairs of Herr Mueller could possibly concern me, Monsieur Poirot." "You knew him, did you not?" A flicker of something, fear, anger, crossed her features. "I knew him long ago during Thor. It was an unpleasant acquaintance." "Could you be more specific?" "I prefer not to discuss that period of my life," she replied coldly. "Suffice, you don't say that. Heinrich Miller was not a man I wished to encounter again. Yet you chose to take passage on the same ship." "I was unaware of his presence until after we had departed. By then, it was too late to make alternative arrangements." Poirot studied her carefully. "And you had no recent contact with the deceased?" "None whatsoever." As the formal questioning concluded, I accompanied Poirot back to our cabins, my head spinning with a complex web of motives and relationships that had been revealed. "Good heavens, Poirot," I said as we walked along the corridor. "Anyone optum could have wanted Miller dead. The niece stands to inherit his fortune. Brenna has a powerful motive for revenge. And even the doctor seems to have had some sort of professional relationship that troubled him. Indeed, Manami, and what of that contest? She's certainly hiding something," I admitted. "But what could connect a Serbian aristocrat to a German industrialist?" "That," said Poirot, "is one of the questions we must answer. But first, I think Westhall examined the physical evidence more thoroughly." We paused outside the Countess's cabin, where I noticed that the door stood slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening, I caught a glimpse of her dressing table, which was covered with jewelry that seemed remarkably extensive for her. A woman who had supposedly lost everything in the war. The piece appeared to be of extraordinary quality. Diamonds, emeralds, and pearls That would have commanded substantial sums. Curious, murmured Poirot, noting my observation. For someone who has lost her fortune, the Countess seems to have retained some rather valuable possessions. So we continued to our own quarters, ere reflected on the morning's revelations. Each suspect had revealed compelling greens to wish Heinrich Muller dead. Yet each had also provided information that seemed to support the suicide theory. The case was becoming more complex rather than clearer, and I found myself increasingly confused about the direction of our investigation. Who, however, seemed energized by the contradictions and complications. High Size held the gleam of a man who had found a puzzle worthy of his considerable abilities. Chapter 4. The Forgery. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Kaiserin Elizabeth's polished deck as Poole and I made our way to the captain's quarters. My friend carried with him the suicide note found in Miller's cabin, along with a magnifying glass, several other items he had requested from the ship's limited supply of writing materials. Voila, Hastings, Poirot announced as we settled into Captain Lindemann's private office. The Time has come to examine this document with the attention it deserves. I watched as he spread the note carefully on the captain's desk, positioning it beneath the reading lamp. The shaky handwriting seemed to tremble even more under the bright light. I can no longer bear the weight of my past sins. The ghosts of the war will not let me rest. I choose to end my suffering. May God forgive me. Heinrich Muller. What strikes you about this note, mon ami? Poirot asked, his magnifying glass hovering over the paper. Well, it's written in a very unsteady hand, I replied, which seems natural enough for a man contemplating suicide. Prossimo, but observe the individual letters more closely, the formation of the M in Muller, for instance, in the way the Hin Heinrich is constructed. I leaned closer, studying the script through Poirot's magnifying glass. It does seem rather deliberate, doesn't it? As if someone was trying very hard to make the letters appear shaky, exacto. And now, regardless, Poole produced a business letter from South Miller's portfolio. This is a genuine sample of H.G.B. Miller's handwriting, dated just 3 days ago. No tethy, natural tremor in his hand. He was, after all, a man of advancing years. But see how different it is from the supposed suicide note. The difference was, indeed, striking. Miller's genuine handwriting, while showing signs of age, had a confident flow that was entirely absent from the suicide note. Seemed artificial, as if someone had deliberately tried to disguise their own hand. Good Lord, I exclaimed, it's a forgery. May we, and a rather skillful one. This was not the work of an amateur. Someone with considerable practice in such matters created this deception. Captain Lindemann entered at that moment, looking thoroughly harried. Supro, I hope you have made some progress. The passengers are becoming increasingly agitated, and I have the ship's owners demanding answers. Indeed, Captain, we have made significant progress, Poirot replied. The suicide note is a forgery. We are dealing with murder, not suicide. The captain's face palled. Murder? But how was that possible? Okay, the cabin was locked from the inside. That is a puzzle we must yet solve. But first, we must determine who among our suspects had access to samples of Herr Miller's handwriting. Our investigation into this question proved most illuminating. From Greta, we learned that she possessed several business letters from her uncle, mostly stern communications regarding her financial allowances. Otto Brenner admitted to having correspondence related to their wartime business dealings. Documents he had preserved as evidence of Miller's treachery. Dr. Richter naturally had medical forms and prescriptions bearing Miller's signature. Any of our three principal suspects could have studied Mulla Shandwinti, I observed as we returned to the corridor. Precisamo. But which one possesses the skill to create such a convincing forgery? This is not merely a matter of copying letters. It requires considerable practice and expertise. As we discussed this puzzle, I noticed a curious sight. Smoke was rising from the direction of the Countess's cabin, visible through her porthole. "I say, Poirot," I said, pointing. "Isn't that rather dangerous on a ship?" Pugh's eyebrows rose sharply. "Indeed, it is. Come, Hastings. We must investigate immediately." We hurried to the Countess's cabin. Rai knocked firmly on the door. "Madame la Comtesse, we noticed smoke. Is everything quite all right?" The door opened to reveal the Countess, looking somewhat flustered, her usually perfect composure slightly disturbed. Behind her, I could see the small fireplace that heated her cabin, flames dancing merrily within. "Oh, M.C. Poirot." "Captain Hastings," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned. I was merely burning some old papers, letters that I no longer wish to keep." "Pardon him, madame," Poirot said smoothly, "but might I suggest that burning papers aboard a ship is somewhat hazardous? Perhaps you would permit me to ensure the fire is properly contained." Before she could object, Poirot had stepped into the cabin. Followed, noting that the Countess seemed distinctly uncomfortable with our presence. The fireplace was indeed burning brightly, and I could see the charred remains of what appeared to be several documents. "Love letters, you understand?" the Countess said quickly. "From long ago. A woman of my age prefers not to be reminded of past romantic entanglements." Poole nodded sympathetically, but I noticed his eyes were studying the ash with considerable interest. "Of course, madame, we all have memories we prefer to forget," after ensuring the fire was safe. We took our leave, but not before Poirot had somehow managed to extract a small sample of the ashes, a skill he had perfected during our many investigations search. "Most convenient," he murmured as we walked away, "that the Countess how to choose this particular moment to destroy personal correspondence. You'll think the timing is suspicious, mon ami. In my experience, when people begin burning papers during a murder investigation, those papers are rarely love letters." That evening, as we dressed for dinner, France, the steward, approached us with information that proved most intriguing. "Monsieur," he said quietly. He remembered something about the night his mother died. "I was up late. Arthritis, you understand. It troubles me sometimes. I was walking the corridors, and I saw someone near her Mila's cabin, very late at night." "Indeed. And what time was this?" "Perhaps 2 o'clock in the morning. I saw a figure in evening dress, elegant clothes. You understand. They seemed to be listening at the door. Could you see who it was?" Frank shook his head regretfully. The corridor was too dark, and I did not wish to intrude. But I remember thinking it was strange. Why would someone be dressed so formally at such an hour? Trezentero murmured. "And you were certain it was sea-bathing dress?" "Yeah, definitely. It's very elegant, very formal, like someone had been to a fine party." After France departed, I found myself increasingly puzzled by the accumulating jitneys. "Evening dress at 2 o'clock in the morning," I mused. "That's certainly odd indeed," Poirot agreed. "And when we consider that all our suspects retired to their cabin shortly after dinner, one must wonder who was wandering the corridors in formal attire at such an hour." Later that evening, Poirot examined the ashes he had collected from the Countess's fireplace using his magnifying glass and infinite patience. He managed to piece together several fragments of charred paper. "Regard Hastings," he said, holding up a partially preserved fragment. "This is not the paper one would expect from love letters. It appears to be much heavier stock, the kind used for official documents. I studied the fragment carefully, though. Badly burned, I could make out what appeared to be part of a governmental seal and several letters that might have been part of a name. Official documents. I asked, what sort of official documents would a Serbian countess need to burn? That is the question, is it not? And why burn them now when their owner has just died under suspicious circumstances? As we prepared for bed, I found myself more confused than ever. The forgery of the suicide note had eliminated the possibility of suicide, but it had also opened up a bewildering array of new questions. Who among our suspects possessed the skill to create such a deception? What was the significance of the burned documents? And who was the mysterious figure in evening dress seen near Muller's cabin in the early hours of the morning? The peaceful cruise that Poirot had envisioned was proving to be anything but restful, and I sensed that we had only begun to scratch the surface, the complex web of deceit that surrounded. Heinrich Muller's death, Chapter 5. Wartime Ghosts. The morning brought with it a gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the increasingly somber atmosphere aboard Kaiserin Elizabeth. As Pua and I made our way to the dining salon for breakfast, I noticed that the passengers had begun to segregate themselves in tasmal, suspicious groups. The easy camaraderie of the first evening had been replaced by an air of mutual distrust that hung over the ship like a pall. Mon ami Poirot observed as we took our seats, said, "Observe how the knowledge of murder changes the dynamics of human behavior. Yesterday, these people were merely fellow travelers. Today, each regards the others as potential killers." Indeed, the change was striking. Otto Brina sat alone at a corner table, his military bearing more pronounced than ever, while Greta Hoffmann picked nervously at her breakfast, her eyes darting about the room with obvious anxiety. Dr. Richter appeared to be deep in conversation with Captain Linderman, their voices low and urgent. Most notably, the Countess was absent from the dining salon altogether. It was after breakfast that Poirot suggested we conduct a more thorough examination of Miller's personal effects. Captain Linderman had sealed the cabin pending our investigation, and with his permission, we began a systematic search of the deceased's belongings. "Reared," Poirot said, lifting a leather-bound volume from Miller's bedside table. Her Muller was a reader of military histories, most appropriate for a man who profited so handsomely from warfare. As he opened the book, a photograph fluttered to the floor. I bent to retrieve it, noting immediately that it was an old wartime photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a younger Heinrich Müller in what appeared to be a military uniform, standing beside a woman in nurse's clothing. The woman's face had been deliberately and violently scratched out with a penner-sharp instrument. How curious, I observed. Someone has taken great pains to obliterate this woman's features. Quo studied the photograph with intense interest, indeed, and observed the setting. Hastings. This appears to be a field hospital. Note the medical tent in the background. The woman's uniform suggests she was a nurse, possibly working in the same area as our Herr Muller. But why scratch out her face so deliberately? That is the question. One does not typically deface a photograph unless the subject evokes strong emotions, love, hatred, or perhaps guilt. Our search of Miller's effects revealed several other items of interest. Among his business papers, we found detailed correspondence regarding pharmaceutical supplies, including several invoices for unusually large quantities of morphine, antibiotics, and surgical instruments. The dates on these documents were all from the war years, and the prices listed were astronomical. Good heavens, I exclaimed, studying one particularly damning invoice. He watch charging 10 times the normal price for basic medical supplies. Precisamo and observe the destinations. Some of these shipments were going to locations that would have been in enemy hands. It was then that Otto Briner appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Msie Pooh, I understand you are examining Heinrich's papers. Perhaps it is time I told you the complete truth about that man's wartime activities. We adjourned to the small conference room, where Briner's account proved even more damning than I had imagined. He described in detail how Miller had systematically cornered the market in medical supplies, driving up prices, while soldiers on both sides of the conflict died from treatable wounds. My brother Fritz was wounded at Stalingrad, Brenner continued, his voice thick with emotion. A simple leg wound that should have healed easily, but the field hospital had no antibiotics. Henrik had bought them all and was selling them to the highest bidder, regardless of which army could pay. Fritz died of gangrene, along with dozens of other young men. And after 3 were, Poirot prompted gently. Heinrich was clever. He had maintained careful records, but he implicated others while keeping his own involvement hidden. With war crimes, investigations began. My family's company was accused of racketeering. We had the invoices, you see, but they showed us as the sellers, not the buyers. Henrik had arranged the paperwork to make it appear that we were the ones charging excessive prices, a most sophisticated deception, Pooh observed. It destroyed us completely, not just financially, but socially. My father died of shame, convinced that his name would forever be associated with profiteering. My mother never recovered from the disgrace. Kana, Fritz, deed for Henrik's greed. After Brenner left, we sought out Dr. Richa, who had been avoiding us since the morning. We found him in the ship's small medical bay, reviewing what appeared to be patient files. Dr. Poirot said, without preamble, "We believe it is time you told us the complete truth about Henrik Muller's condition." Dr. Richter removed his spectacles and cleaned them nervously. I had hoped to maintain pretend confidentially, but under the circumstances being that your patient is dead and we are investigating his murder, Poirot said firmly. Very well, the doctor sighed. Henrik had been suffering from what I can only describe as severe paranoid delusions. He was convinced that someone from his past, someone he believed to be dead, was alive and seeking revenge. Did he mention any specific individual? He spoke of a woman, a nurse he had known during the war. He claimed she had discovered his business arrangements and Dad threatened to expose him. According to Henrik, she died in a bombing raid, but he had become convinced that she had somehow survived and was now hunting him, and you treated him for this condition. I prescribed sedatives and advised him to seek psychiatric care. But Henrik was a proud man. He refused to believe it. His fears were irrational. He insisted that this woman was real, that she was close to him, and that she meant to make him pay for his crimes. Doctor, Poirot said carefully, in your examination of the body, did you note anything unusual about the compounds in H. Miller's system? Dr. Richter hesitated. Actually, yes. Beyond the narcotic that killed him, there were traces of several other substances. Mild sedatives, certainly, but also some rather unusual compounds that I couldn't immediately identify. Unusual in what way? They appeared to be experimental pharmaceuticals. Compounds that might have been available during the war, but are rarely seen today. It was as if someone with extensive knowledge of wartime medical supplies been preparing him, perhaps. That afternoon, Poirot decided to test the Countess's story about her Serbian estate. Through the ship's wireless, contacted several European authorities requesting information about the Marovich family properties. The response, when it came, was illuminating. According to the Serbian government, the Morovich estate had indeed been destroyed during the war. but the family records showed no surviving female heir. More significantly, the Countess's supposed family castle had been demolished, not by bombing, but by their retreating German army in 1944. Treason, Teresa, Poirot murmured as he read the wireless message. The Countess story has several significant inconsistencies. You think she's lying about her identity? I think, mon ami, that our elegant Countess is not what she appears to be. The question is, who is she really? And what is her connection to Heinrich Müller? That evening, as we prepared for what would prove to be our final dinner board, the Casa, in Elizabeth, I found myself increasingly troubled by the accumulating evidence. The photograph of the mysterious nurse, the traces of unusual compounds in Müller's system, and the Countess's fabricated background all seemed to point toward common conclusion. Pro, I said, as we dressed for dinner. Do you think it's possible that this mysterious nurse, the one Müller Belliot was hunting him, could actually be alive? Hastings, you begin to see the shape of the truth. Yes, I believe it is not only possible, but probable. The question is, which of our suspects is she? As we made our way to the dining salon, I reflected on how quickly our peaceful cruise had transformed into a complex murder investigation. The wartime ghosts that had haunted Heinrich Müller seemed to have reached out from the past to claim their revenge, and I had the distinct feeling that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. Chapter 6. False Confessions. The morning of our third day aboard the Kaiserin, Elizabeth dawned with an unexpected drama that would shake the foundations of our investigation. I was awakened by urgent knocking at my cabin door and found Captain Lindemann standing in the corridor, his face bearing an expression of profound relief mixed with confusion. "Captain Hastings," he said breathlessly, "you must come at once. Briner has requested to speak with MCPY immediately. He claims he wishes to confess to the murder of Heinrich Müller." I dressed hastily and accompanied the captain to Poirot's cabin, where we found my friend already impeccably groomed despite the early hour. His eyes held that peculiar gleam that indicated his mind was working at full capacity. "Ah, Hastings," he said, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. "It appears our case has taken a most unexpected turn. Shall we hear what Herr Briner has to say?" We made our way to the conference room, where Otto Briner sat, rigidly upright, his military bearing more pronounced than ever. His face was pale but determined, and his hands rested steadily on the table before him. He looked, I thought, like a man who had reached some momentous decision. "Mon Poirot," Briner began without preamble, "I can no longer bear the weight of deception. I killed Heinrich Müller, and am prepared to face the consequences of my actions." Captain Lindemann exhaled audibly, clearly relieved at this apparent resolution to the crisis. However, I noticed that Poirot's expression remained skeptical, his head tilted slightly to one side in the manner that indicated he was not entirely convinced. Poirot replied mildly, "This is most interesting, H. Briner. Perhaps you would care to explain the circumstances of this confession." Briner's jaw tightened. "I have told you of my brother's death, of the destruction of my family's honor. For years, I have carried the burden of knowing that Heinrich Müller lived in luxury while better men died because of his greed. When I learned he would be aboard this ship, I saw it as providence, an opportunity to exact the justice that the courts had failed to deliver." "And how precisely did you accomplish this justice?" Pooh asked, his tone remaining conversational. "I gained access to his cabin using a duplicate key," Briner replied steadily. "Had observed the steward's routine and managed to obtain an impression of his master key during the first evening. Entered Miller's cabin while he slept and forced him to drink a fatal dose of morphine dissolved in brandy. You compelled him to drink poison, Poirot observed, and he offered no resistance. He was already heavily sedated. Dr. Richter had prescribed medication for his paranoid delusions, and I had managed to increase the dosage earlier that evening. He was barely conscious when I entered his cabin. I found myself impressed by the apparent thoroughness of Brynner's confession. Every detail seemed to fit with the evidence we had discovered, and his motive was certainly powerful enough to drive a man to murder. The suicide note, Poirot inquired. I forged it using samples of his handwriting from our business correspondence. I felt that suicide would be appropriate for a man who had caused so much death. Yet something in Poirot's manner suggested he was far from satisfied with this explanation. He continued to study Brynner with that peculiar intensity, though it indicated his mind was working through some complex problem. "Tell me, Herr Brynner," Poirot said suddenly, "when you entered Miller's cabin, was the writing desk lamp illuminated?" Brynner hesitated for just a moment. "Yes, it was. He had been working late, going through his papers, Trace, Enter, and the brandy glass." "Where exactly did you place it after he had consumed its contents?" K, on the desk beside his right hand, arranged the scene to appear as natural as possible. It was then that I noticed the Countess Morovich entering the room. Though she had not been summoned, her usually perfect composure seemed strained, and she moved with a nervous energy that was entirely unlike her previous aristocratic calm. "Hope I am not intruding," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I heard that there had been developments in the investigation." "Indeed," Madame Poirot replied. "Herr Brynner has confessed to the murder of Heinrich Müller." The Countess's reaction was most peculiar. Rather than relief or satisfaction, she appeared to become increasingly agitated. Her hands fluttered nervously, and she seemed unable to remain still. "Confessed," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "But surely there must be some mistake." "No mistake," Madame Brynner said firmly. "I have told Miss Poirot everything. Justice has been served." "But the timing," the Countess protested. "Surely the timing is so wrong. Heinrich's cabin door was locked from the inside. How could you have escaped without being seen?" I was struck by the strangeness of her objection. Why would the Countess who had claimed to despise Miller be so concerned about the details of his killer's escape? "I am afraid, Madame," Brynner replied, "that I must have confused you with some authority tale. The mechanics of the crime are not your concern." "Not my concern." The Countess's voice became shrill. "But you cannot simply, that is, surely M.C. Poirot must verify these details. The position of the desk, the arrangement of the papers, whether the small writing lamp was turned toward the wall or away from it." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Poirot's eyebrows rose sharply, and he saw his green eyes focus on the Countess with sudden, intense interest. "Pardon him, Madame," he said softly, "but how is it that you know about the position of the writing lamp with the arrangement of papers on her Muller's desk?" The Countess realized her mistake immediately. Her face flushed crimson, and she seemed to shrink within herself. I simply assumed that as surely all writing desks are arranged in a similar manner." "Indeed," Poirot replied, his tone now carrying a note of silk-oat steel. Yet who spoke with such specific knowledge of details that were never made public. Most curious for someone who claimed never to have entered the D6 cabin. At this moment, Dr. Richter entered the room looking somewhat harried. "Well, I beg your pardon," he said. "Babu's town, but I felt I must speak. Herr Brynner, I cannot allow you to continue with this deception." "Deception?" Captain Linderman asked, clearly confused. I am afraid that her Briner could not possibly have committed this crime, Dr. Rich Tor announced. At the time Henrik died, her Briner was in my cabin, seeking medical attention for a severe bout of insomnia. I administered a strong sedative, and he remained under my observation until well after dawn. Brina's face contorted with frustration. Doctor, I must ask you not to interfere. My confession stands, but it cannot stand, Dr. Richter insisted. I have detailed notes of our consultation, including the exact time and dosage of medication administered. You were unconscious in my cabin when Heinrich died. The Countess had grown, increasingly pallid during this exchange, and I observed that her hands were now trembling quite visibly. Whatever careful plans she had made, Tobrenna's false confession had clearly disrupted them in some fundamental way. Miss Poirot announced, rising from his chair. We have arrived at a most interesting juncture. A confession that cannot be true, an alibi that cannot be questioned, and knowledge where none should exist. I believe the time has come to examine this case from an entirely different perspective. The Countess stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. If you will excuse me, she said, her voice barely under control. I find myself quite unwell. This discussion of such unpleasant matters. She fled the room before anyone could respond, leaving behind an atmosphere of attention and confusion. Brenna remained seated, his confession having been thoroughly undermined, while Dr. Richter looked deeply troubled by the implications of his intervention. As I watched the Countess's hurried departure, I found myself wondering what secrets lay behind her intimate knowledge of Miller's cabin and her desperate reaction to Brenna's false confession. The case had taken another unexpected turn, and I had the distinct feeling that we were finally approaching the heart of the mystery that had brought death to our peaceful cruise. Chapter 7. The Little Gray Cells. The departure of the Countess left an uncomfortable silence in the conference room. Captain Lindemann looked thorough bewildered, while Otto Brina sat with his head in his hands, his false confession having crumbled in the face of Dr. Richter's irrefutable alibi. It was Poirot who broke the silence, his voice carrying the quiet authority that I had come to associate with his moments of greatest intellectual clarity. He began, rising from his chair and beginning to pace the small room. The time has come to employ the little gray cells in earnest. We have witnessed a most instructive repenting, a confession that cannot be true, offered by a man who never thalaspis his intimate knowledge of the crime. But if Rubina did not commit murder, Captain Lindemann protested, then who did? That is precisely the question we must answer. But first, let us examine why Herr Briner's confession must be false, not merely because of Dr. Richter's alibi, but because of the fundamental contradictions in the crime itself. Poirot paused in his pacing and faced us directly. Consider, if you will, the supposed method described by Herr Brenner. He claims to have forced the semi-conscious Mueller to drink poison dissolved in brandy. Yet the post-mortem examination revealed no signs of struggle, no bruising about the throat or mouth that would indicate force was used. Perhaps Miller was too heavily sedated to resist. One suggested proximal, and herein lies the first contradiction. If Miller was so heavily sedated as to be unable to resist, how then could he have been conscious enough to drink? The dosage required to render a man helpless would also make it impossible for him to swallow liquids without assistance. Dr. Richter nodded slowly. Monsieur Poirot is correct. The level of sedation would have compromised the swallowing reflex. It would have been extremely difficult to force liquid down his throat without leaving evidence. Furthermore, Poirot continued, consider the psychology of our false confessor. Brenner is a man of military bearing, trained in direct action. If he had truly decided to kill Henrik Mueller, Would he have chosen such an elaborate method? Would he not have simply struck him down or used a more straightforward means? Then, how was the murder committed? Captain Linderman asked. Now we approach the heart of the matter. The murder was accomplished not through force, but through intimacy. The killer was someone Miller trusted, someone who could enter his cabin without arousing suspicion, someone who could sit with him and share a drink, someone who could administer poison in a manner that seemed natural and unthreatening. I felt a chill of understanding begin to creep over me. You mean someone he knew well? More than that, Hastings. Someone he had known for many years. Someone whose very presence in his cabin would have seemed inevitable. Poirot moved to the small writing desk in the corner of the room and withdrew the magnifying glass he had been using to examine evidence. Let us now consider the physical evidence with fresh eyes. The lipstick trace on the brandy glass. This was not accidental contamination, but a deliberate clue left by someone who wanted us to understand the true nature of the crime. He produced a Smalaviden's bag containing cotton swabs. I have taken samples of cosmetics from me of our female passengers. The lipstick found on the murder weapon is a very specific shade, Rouge Noir Picotti, a color that was particularly popular during the war years, but is rarely seen today. And I prompted, and it matches exactly the lipstick found in the Countess cabin, but more significantly, it is a shade that would have been readily available to a woman working in a field hospital during the war. Dr. Richter leaned forward with interest. You're suggesting that the killer was Anor's? I am suggesting that the killer was the nurse, the woman whose face was so violently scratched from Henrik Miller's photograph, the woman he believed to be dead, but who haunted his paranoid delusions. But the Countess, I protested, she's Serbian nobility. Surely she couldn't be. Hastings. But what if the Countess Morovich is not who she claims to be? What if she is, in fact, Sammy Niels entirely? Someone who has assumed a false identity for the specific purpose of approaching Henrik Muller. Poirot moved to the window and gazed out at the Danube flowing past. Consider the evidence we have gathered. The Countess's story about her casa. Serbian estate contains significant inconsistencies. Her jewelry collection seems remarkably extensive for someone who has suppossessed at least everything. She demonstrated intimate knowledge of Muller's cabin layout, and most tellingly, she became extremely agitated when Herr Brenner's false confession threatened to end our investigation prematurely. But why would she want the investigation to continue? Captain Linderman asked. Because, mon Capitan, she had not yet achieved her true purpose. The murder of Henrik Muller was not the end of her plan. It was merely the beginning. At this moment, Franz, the steward, appeared at the door looking rather nervous. Pardon, Mo, but I have been thinking about what it told you yesterday. About the person in evening dress I saw near Herr Muller's cabin, France. What about it? I remembered something else. The person was carrying something, a small case or bag, and when they turned to go, I saw them clearly in moonlight from the port hole. It was definitely a woman, and she was wearing Avery distinctive necklace emeralds. I think Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. And this necklace, have you seen it since, Signor? The Countess wore it to dinner last night. After France departed, Poirot turned back to us with the expression of a man who had just fitted the final piece into a complex puzzle. The picture becomes clearer, he announced. We are dealing with a woman who has spent years planning her revenge, not merely for herself, but for all those who suffered and died because of Heinrich Miller's wartime profiteering. She has assumed a false identity, positioned herself carefully, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. But who is she really? I asked. Goddess, or the wireless messages I sent yesterday become most illuminating. Poirot withdrew a folded telegram from his pocket. Have received word from the German authorities regarding Heinrich Miller's personal history. It appears that he was married during the war to a young woman named Anna Kellner, who worked as a nurse in a field hospital. She was reported killed in a bombing raid in 1944, but her body was never recovered. The implications of this revelation struck me like a physical blow. Good Lord, Yumi and the Countess is actually, I believe, Manami, that the elegant Serbian Countess Marvich is none other than Anna Kellner, Heinrich Miller's supposedly dead wife. Oh, has spent years rebuilding her life and waiting for the opportunity to exact their revenge. But why not simply expose him? Why murder? Because exposure would not have been sufficient. Anna Kellner died in that bombing raid. Hastings did as surely as if she had been buried beneath the rubble. The woman who emerged from the war was someone else entirely. Someone who had witnessed the true cost of her husband's greed. And Dad determined that he must pay the ultimate price. I found myself struggling to process the complex psychology behind such an elaborate deception. The patience it must have required. I murmured, the careful planning, the assumption of an entirely new identity. Indeed, and now we must determine her ultimate objective. For I am convincing that Heinrich Miller's death was not the end of her plan, but merely the first step in a more complex scheme, as if summoned by our conversation. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and we heard the Countess' voice speaking urgently to someone. Poirot moved swiftly to the door and opened it slightly, allowing us to observe her in heated conversation with Captain Linderman's wireless operator. It is most urgent, she was saying. The message must be sent immediately to the Swiss authorities. There are certain financial arrangements that must be completed before we reach port. Poe closed the door quietly and turned back to us with a grim expression. I believe, Mimi, that we are about to witness the second phase of Anna Kellner's long-planned revenge. And unless we act quickly, she may yet succeed in escaping justice for her crimes. The knowledge that we were so close to the truth, yet still vulnerable to Thekler's final machinations, has filled me with a sense of urgent anticipation. The peaceful cruise that had brought us to this point was about to reach its dramatic conclusion, and I sensed that the next few hours would determine whether justice would truly be served. Chapter 8. The Countess's Secret. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Kaiser and Elizabeth's Main. Salon Aspero requested that all passengers gather for what he termed the final clarification of this most complex affair. The atmosphere was charged with tension as our small group assembled. Greta Hoffman, pale and anxious. Otto Brenner, maintaining his military bearing despite his failed confession. Dr. Prika, adjusting his spectacles nervously, and Captain Min, looking thoroughly exhausted by the events of the past few days. Most notably, the Countess Morovich had initially refused to attend, claiming illness, but Poirot had insisted with such quiet authority that she finally appeared, her usual aristocratic composure now visibly strained. Madame Emu, Poirot began, standing before the assembled group with his hands clasped behind his back. We have witnessed a most extraordinary crime, not merely a murder, but an elaborate orchestration of justice spanning manures. The death of Heinrich Müller was neither suicide nor crime of passion, but the culmination of a carefully planned revenge that began in the ruins of war-torn Europe. He paused, his green eyes surveying each face in turn. Before we proceed to the identity of Thekler, let us first understand the true nature of the victim. Heinrich Miller was not merely a successful industrialist, but a man whose wartime profiteering cost countless lives, while soldiers died from treatable wounds. Miller cornered medical supplies and sold them to the highest bidder, regardless of nationality or need. The Count shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Among those who suffered from Miller's greed was a young nurse named Anna Kellner, who worked in a field hospital and witnessed firsthand the deaths of men who could have been saved. Anna was more than a witness to these tragedies. She was Heinrich Muller's wife. A collective gasp arose from the assembled passengers. Greta Hoffman's eyes widened in shock, while Otto Briner leaned forward with intense interest. Anna Kellner died in that field hospital, Masami, not from enemy bombs, but from terrible knowledge of her husband's crimes. The woman who emerged from the war was someone entirely different. Someone who had witnessed the true cost of greed and had determined that justice must be served. Poole moved to stand directly before the Countess. "Is that not so, Madame Anna Kellner?" The elegant facade cracked like a broken mirror. The Countess's aristocratic bearing crumbled, and for a moment, the sophisticated woman was replaced by someone altogether more vulnerable and haunted. "You cannot prove that," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "Contra, Madame, the evidence is overwhelming. Okay. The lipstick trace on the brandy glass matches your cosmetics. Exactly. Rouge Noir by Coty, a shade popular during the war years. Okay. The emerald necklace seen by France, the steward, is among your possessions. Your intimate knowledge of Heinrich's cabin layout, demonstrated so clearly yesterday, could only have come from some man who had shared his living space for years." Poirot withdrew the damaged photograph from his pocket. The photograph, found among Heinrich's possessions, shows him with a young Nurse Wool's face has been violently scratched out. The uniform, the setting, the man's younger appearance, all consistent with a wartime field hospital. Heinrich kept this photograph as a memento of his supposedly dead wife, but the scratched-out face reveals his guilt in his desperate attempt to forget what he hadn't. The Countessa closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held a different quality entirely. Gotten was the aristocratic art, replaced by something far more complex and deeply human. "Did you deduce the method of the murder?" the Richter asked quietly. That required understanding the psychology of the killer. Could not simply force poison down Heinrich's throat. Such violence would have left evidence. Instead, she relied on their charade history. She appeared at his cabin in the evening dress, France observed, presenting herself as the ghost Heinrich had feared, but also, perhaps, secretly hoped to see. Poirot began to pace, his voice taking on the rhythm of a man unraveling a complex tapestry. Heinrich's paranoid delusions were not entirely unfounded. He sensed that his supposedly dead wife was indeed a Leviant, close to him when Anna appeared at his cabin that night, wearing the emerald necklace he had given her years before. He was simultaneously terrified and mesmerized. She was his greatest fear and his deepest guilt made manifest. But the locked cabin, Captain Lindemont fretted. How did she escape? She did not need to escape. Captain Anna never left Heinrich's cabin alive. That is, she never left as the Countess Marovich. She remained with her husband as he drank the poisoned brandy, watching as the man who had betrayed everything she held sacred finally paid the price for his crimes. Only when he was dead did she unlock the door from the inside and become the Countess once more. It's the compounds found in his system, Dr. Richter added, the unusual wartime euphemisms, appeasement. Anna had retained her medical knowledge from her nursing days, and her new identity as the Countess provided her with access to pharmaceutical surplus through her various charitable activities. She had been preparing for this moment for years, carefully acquiring the specific compounds needed to ensure Heinrich's death would be both certain and relatively peaceful. Anna looked up at Poirot with a mixture of defiance and resignation. Quoi? Worse than a peaceful death. Do you know how many men died while he counted his profits? How many families were destroyed by his greed? Indeed, madame. And that brings us to the final aspect of your plan, one that extends far beyond simple revenge. The wireless messages you have been sending, the financial arrangements with Swiss authorities. You have not merely been planning your escape, have you? For the first time, Anna's expression showed something approaching pride. Heinrich's fortune was built on blood money. I have spent the past 2 years documenting his wartime activities, gathering evidence of his profiteering and identifying the families who suffered because of his actions. Wealth will be distributed among them, a form of justice that the courts never provided. So burn documents in your cabin, I interjected, understanding flooding over me. They weren't love letters, identity papers. She confirmed the culmination of my transformation from Anna Kellner to the Countess Marvich. I had hoped to complete my work before destroying the last evidence of my deception, but circumstances aced her. Poirot nodded slowly, and herein lies true tragedy of this case. Anna Kellner sought not merely personal revenge, but a form of justice that extended to all those who had suffered from Heinrich's crimes. She had become an instrument of retribution for the voiceless, dead. Then you understand why I did it, Anna said, meeting Poirot's eyes directly. Heinrich Muller lived in luxury, while better men died in agony. Someone had to balance the scales. Alas, madame, I understand your motivation completely, but understanding is not the same as condoning means murder, regardless of the nobility of the motive. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle sound of the Danube flowing past the shop's hall. Each person in the salon seemed lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the complex moral questions raised by Anna's actions. Captain Lindemann finally spoke. What will happen now? The Poirot reply depends upon many factors. The authorities in Vienna will need to be notified, and there will be legal proceedings. But I suspect that when the full extent of Heinrich Muller's wartime crimes becomes known, there will be some who will view Anna's actions as justice rather than murder. As the gathering began to disperse, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary woman who had orchestrated such an elaborate revenge. Anna Kellner had died in that field hospital, consumed by the knowledge of her husband's betrayal. The Countess Moravich had been born from the death, carrying within her not only the desire for personal vengeance, but also the determination to serve justice for all those who had suffered. The peaceful cruise that Poirot had envisioned had indeed become a journey into the darkest corners of human nature. But it had also revealed the complex motivations that drive people to extraordinary acts. As the Kaiserin Elizabeth continued its stately progress down the Danube, I found myself pondering the eternal questions of justice and revenge, and wondering whether the line between them was as clear as I had once believed. In the end, the case of Heinrich Muller's death would be remembered not merely as a clever murder mystery, but as a profound meditation on the costs of war, the nature of justice, and the lengths to which a determined individual will go to balance the scales of moral accounting. Anna Kellner's long journey from grieving widow to avenging angel had reached its conclusion, but the questions raised by her actions would linger long after the Kaiserin Elizabeth reached its final destination. Thanks for joining us for Death on the Danube. If you enjoyed this intricate tale, offer time profiteering and elaborate revenge, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, this is your host, signing off from Stories Cafe.